Chapter 8 The Hunters. Thad rode Bullet, not from choice, but because Scar Pony was riding Little Bit. Thad had no argument about it. He was biding his time. He had adorned Bullet with feathers and paint. Except for certain thoughts inside, he felt like a real Comanche. He could not have looked much like an Indian boy, for the walnut dye was wearing off his freckles, and his light-colored hair was growing in again. Several of the young braves went with them, their bodies bare except for breechclouts and moccasins and a few feathers in their hair. A buffalo robe was rolled and tied to the back of each saddle. The nights were still cold, although spring was on the way. Reaching the region where scouts had reported antelope, they searched the horizon. At last, one of the young men called with suppressed excitement, "There! They go there!" Whistling Dog and one of the other braves each put an antelope's head, complete with horns, on his head. It gave a realistic imitation of a living antelope. The hunters dropped from their ponies and left them with one of the boys. Then they crept toward the slope where the game had been spotted, each holding a dried tumbleweed in front of him. Soon Whistling Dog gave them a signal to lie quietly where they were. They watched until a head appeared not far away. Then a white rump showed as the animal turned his back toward the hunters. Whistling Dog slowly raised his lance with a white cloth attached to his point. This he held very still. The only movement was the fluttering of the cloth. Antelope were curious creatures and will risk their lives to investigate something strange. The antelope on the slope threw up his head again, and almost immediately 8 or 10 more heads appeared. Then they lowered again as the animals resumed their grazing. Again, Whistling Dog raised the lance. The first antelope took a step or two toward the hunters, while the others watched. Whenever the antelope lowered their heads to graze again, the hunters crept silently forward. Finally, they were within easy arrow shot. Whistling Dog raised his mask, and every one of the hunters let fly with an arrow at an animal already selected. It was hard to tell who had scored hits, but 7 antelope went down. Most of them were shot through the neck. The other antelope, including the one which Thad had aimed, were off in a flash, their white rumps bobbing against the plain. The hunters jumped to their feet. They ran for a moment in the direction the antelope had taken. Then they turned back to the skinning of those they had shot. Now the hour was late, and the hunters were far from home. They decided to make camp for the night where they were. Cutting ribs from one of the antelope, they roasted them over a fire of buffalo chips. While the meat cooked, the hunters stretched their tired bodies in the warm glow of the fire. They talked as men and boys of race love to talk on such an occasion. They talked as men and boys of any race love to talk on such an occasion. Scarponi and Thad sat beside each other, each holding a piece of meat on a forked stick. It was time when friendly talk, even between enemies, came easy. Scarponi kept up a running conversation with Thad, most of it being about the events of the day. Then he said, "Spotted Boy, I saw you before 2 lances found you at the creek." "When did you ever see me?" Thad asked. "With Long Arrow. I followed you and the two women on the horses. We shot arrows at you, but we did not try to hit you. Our men were a long way off. It was only to see you run. I don't remember riding far with two women, Thad said. One woman was young. She had two little ones. The older woman took one of the little ones on her saddle when you heard the drums from our camp, Scarponi explained. You were riding my black bird. Then Thad remembered. It was the day that they had been to visit the Bransons, Ma and Miss Ellie Clark, and the little ones. The older woman was my mother, Thad said. But when did you see me besides that time? Once when you and your dogs and some boys of the Long Knives had a raccoon treed. The dogs fought the raccoon, and he almost drowned one of them. Oh, said Thad. One was my brother, and the other was the brother of the white girl who lives in Buffalo Horn's lodge. They call her Sleepwalk Girl. You were laughing at us. We laughed at the dogs and the raccoon, Scarponi explained. I remember well, Thad said. I felt as though someone were looking at me, and when I looked up, I saw you. But I didn't know until now that it was you. He remembered that he had noticed the friendly expression on the face of one of the three Comanche boys that day, even as Scarponi's face now wore a look of friendship. Who are the others with you? Thad asked. Running Fox and Boy Who Laughs were there, Scarponi answered. But there were others, older men, in the woods behind us. We did not want to fight them. The warriors were planning an attack on a ranch before morning. Thad laughed. It's a good thing for us that you did not want to fight. We boys were alone and had little ammunition. I too am glad we did not fight, Scarponi agreed, or you would not be my friend now. One of the things about the Comanches that Thad disliked was their boastfulness. After a buffalo hunt or a raid, the men told long-winded stories around the village fires, pompously describing their brave deeds. Two Lances and his friends had even made a great story of of their courage in capturing Thad at the creek. It was ridiculous to think it took any great bravery to capture a lone boy by surprise. Whistling Dog and another young warrior, Rising Bear, were listening down to the conversation of the two boys. Whistling Dog spoke to Thad. I've seen in the houses of the Long Knives the books that talk. Do books talk to you? For a moment Thad did not understand what Whistling Dog meant. Then it dawned on him. He was asking if Thad could read. He nodded his head. Yes, they talk to me, he said. I have heard that the Long Knives have a great book from the heavens, said Whirlwind. He had waited a long time before speaking of this, and the pause showed the importance he attached to his words. Following this custom, Thad took his time to answer Whirlwind. He hoped thus to convince him that he considered this part of the conversation important too. The hunters listened to him as he answered. We have such a book, he said. What does the book talk? What does the talking book from the heavens tell you? Whistling Dog asked. Another long wait, during which the boy appeared to be thinking. Then Thad answered. The book tells us many things about God who lives beyond the sun. He made the sun. The sun gives us life, Whistling Dog said. The sun merely warms us, Thad replied. Does the book tell how we may defeat our enemies? Whirlwind asked. Thad gave some long thought. He was trying to recall some of the scripture texts he had learned. but not one would come to his mind. The eyes of the other hunters were upon him, waiting for his answer. Finally, he had an inspiration. The book tells us that the Father God sent his Son from heaven to tell us that we must love everybody. We must love even our enemies. As he spoke these words, Thad thought of the hatred he had felt for these his enemies. He was not paying heed to the teachings of the book himself. A long silence followed, during which the boys and young men sat with bowed heads. He wondered what they were thinking. At last, Whistling Dog spoke, quite reasonably. If we love our enemy, he is no longer our enemy. How then can we kill him? Thad pondered this question, then answered, I reckon we couldn't. The subject was something beyond his power to explain, and perhaps he thought the others found it as difficult. After a few hours of wrestling in which Thad could hold his own with any of the other boys his age, the hunters rolled themselves in their robes and slept beside the dying fire. Thad looked up at the few stars that he had so often watched from home, felt himself a part of this wild life and these people. Still, there were times when he lay awake and longed for his own house and his own kind of people. There were guns in Yellow Cloud's camp, but not enough for all the braves. To Thad it seemed that the Indians were better marksmen with bow and arrow or lance than with guns. He himself had never become as expert with bow and arrow as he was with a gun. So when Scarponi told him there was to be a buffalo hunt and that the boys would be allowed to go along, he decided to ask Yellow Cloud for the use of one of the two guns that hung in his teepee. I'm not so good as shooting with the bow and arrow as with the rifle, he explained. Yellow Cloud asked, Can you bring down the buffalo with the gun? I think so, Thad answered, not wishing to make a definite promise. Many buffalo have been found, Yellow Cloud said. They will soon be gone to the north, so we must get plenty of meat for our women to dry. Then will you let me use the gun? Thad asked again. Maybe gun, maybe bow, was all the answer he got from Yellow Cloud as he turned back into his lodge. Before daylight the following morning, Thad brought Bullet to the door of the lodge to saddle him for the hunt. As he did so, Yellow Cloud brought him the gun from behind his backrest. It was a muzzle loader, of course, as were most rifles at the time. As Thad sighted along the barrel, he wished he had been given time with it to get the feel of this one. The hunters rode northward, following the buffalo herd. It came on the buffalo at mid-morning, a vast black mass of animals grazing quietly in the sun. The hunters, who had brought buffalo headgear, now donned them and crept on foot toward their prey. The foolish buffalo scarcely lifted their heads, so it was easy for the hunters to approach them in their disguise. Thad guessed there were many thousands of animals, for the black, slowly moving mass reached as far as the eye could see and well beyond. Thad was not first permitted to fire his gun, for the Comanches had a system of buffalo hunting that to him seemed cruel. It kept the buffalo from becoming alarmed too soon. However, it enabled the hunters to get all the meat they needed before the animals could stampede. Running alongside the herd on their ponies, keeping pace with the buffalo, each lancer chose a beast and paced it until he had a good target. Suddenly he leaned forward, his lance raised in both hands, and drove it into the loins of the buffalo. A backward heave of the hunter's body brought the lance point free of the wounded animal, and it fell. The poor beast was only wounded, and the lancer rode on after another target. He was followed by the boys and one or two old men, who finished killing the wounded beasts with bow and arrow. Then some of the old men and the women came to skin the carcasses. When at last the buffalo herd awoke to the fact that they were under attack and were alarmed by the smell of blood, Red Wolf gave the signal to those who carried guns. Until now the slaughter had been silent. Now Thad, with the others who had guns, raced along the frightened, madly running horde of animals. Thad shot one, dropped to the ground, and reloaded, threw himself on his horse to race and shoot again. Several times he reloaded, raced, and shot, taking care that he hit a vital spot in each, aiming for the neck or a point just behind the shoulder. He left no wounded animals to await the mercy of death. When buffalo had departed, the killing halted. A mile or more had been covered by the hunters. Their trail was marked by carcasses of fallen animals, with women and old men at work upon them. The hunters washed themselves at a little stream and returned to the campfires. The women were already roasting fat humps and ribs of buffalo. After a rest, the boys, still excited from the hunt, started a hand wrestling match. A boy placed the side of his foot against that of his opponent. Then, grasping hands, they endeavored to throw the other. Thad had noticed how changeable and childish an Indian modes changed might be. One moment Yellow Cloud might be laughing and joking with the women or playing with Blue Flower's baby. The next moment he might take offense at some small thing and give the offender a beating. At first, Thad had been outraged at such treatment of a woman by a man, but it seemed to be the accustomed thing among the Indians. When it happened that Little Rabbit was the one punished, she would take out her ire on Blue Flower, slapping her, scolding her, and setting her at some difficult task. Sometimes it was Thad who caught the brunt of her anger. Thad had wrestled often with the other boys. One of the best wrestlers was Small Weasel, about the same age and same size as Thad. They were evenly matched, and sometimes Thad had been thrown again and again by Small Weasel. Sometimes he had been able to throw the other boy. Today Thad threw Small Weasel 3 times in succession. Small Weasel was never the most handsome boy in Yellow Cloud's band. His eyes were small, glittering beads close set in his face that was heavily pockmarked. Now as he leaped to his feet after his third fall, his face was the mask of evil. Crazed anger and forgetting all the rules of the sport, he came up with a lance in his hand and threw it at Thad with all his might. Had it landed where he aimed, there would have been no more Spotted Boy. But Thad dodged just in time, made only a deep flesh wound in the muscle of his upper arm. Small Weasel seized another lance, but Thad threw a rock at him, hitting Small Weasel in the forehead. The Indian boy dropped to the ground like a dead buffalo. Thad feared that he had harmed the other boy more than he had intended, knelt over him, Chafing Small Weasel's hands, he called to Scarponi, "Get water!" Scarponi came running with a gourd full of water. As Thad bathed the boy's face and head with it, Small Weasel opened his eyes and sat up, rubbing his head. He looked at Thad in surprise when he realized that the white boy was leaning over him, not to harm him, but to help. Now Thad helped him to his feet and led him to the women at the campfire. Scarponi, Boy Who Laughs, and Running Fox were speechless with amazement at such behavior. In a perplexed tone of voice, Scarponi asked, "Why does Spotted Boy help his enemy? Small Weasel tried to kill you. Is it because you do as the book from heaven tells you?" Boy Who Laughs wondered. Thad shrugged his shoulders. He could not explain his action, except to say he was brought up that way. "Small Weasel is not my enemy," he said. "He was angry because I beat him at wrestling. Wouldn't you have helped him?" The Indian boys shook their heads. Surely, they thought, the ways of the Long Knives were strange indeed.